This is Jay Dyer from Jay's Analysis. You're listening to Esoteric Hollywood. Esoteric Hollywood is where I deconstruct the biggest films in an unparalleled way, from the classics of the silver screen to today's blockbusters. Learn to watch film with new eyes as we enter Esoteric Hollywood. Greetings, welcome back to Jay's Analysis, my friends, subscribers especially. Thank you, all you subscribers out there. Today we're going to talk about Marcus Aurelius, the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. And you're listening to Jay's Analysis. My website is jaysanalysis.com, and I deal with philosophy, theology, the esoteric, movie reviews, film analysis. I do a lot of stand-up, a lot of comedy, a lot of impressions. I do all kinds of crazy stuff. But I also do philosophy talks and lectures. And so what we're going to do is maybe skip back and go and talk about some of the older post-Greek stuff into the Roman period. Because I had some requests, actually. People said, you didn't ever talk about anything Stoic. What about the Stoics? And that's interesting because the Stoics are influenced by the Greeks. They were very interested in continuing the Greek tradition with that sort of Hellenized period of the Roman Empire. And Stoicism is interesting. It's not the best philosophy, I don't think, but it's interesting. And you had the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius influenced by Stoicism. So the first thing that we want to do is, you know that I'm very much a fan of channeling. And so I got my hair cut into this fashy haircut, they call it, because we're going to actually channel Marcus Aurelius, the emperor, today. You ready? So close your eyes, put your legs up into a lotus position. And the way that we channel the Roman emperor is that instead of doing this, the way that we might meditate, we're going to, Hail Caesar, Hail Caesar. This is a very controversial hand movement. Now, you can do this all day. Fight the power, right? You can be a communist Marxist, but if you dared to do Hail Caesar, fascist alert, fascist alert. Ugh. Anyway, I'm being silly. We're going to delve into the meditations. And part one will be free for those out there in internet land, and then part two, of course, you can subscribe at Jay's Analysis for $4.95 a month or for $60 a year to get the full talks, lectures, and interviews, and access to the archives where I've talked to a lot of interesting people and done full lectures on the totality of tragedy and hope, Plato's Republic, this kind of stuff. The subscribers are all very happy. 95% approval for subscribers at Jay's Analysis. So Stoicism is interesting. It gives us the idea of a philosopher king, right? So Marcus carries on this notion of Plato's Republic being ruled by the philosopher king, and Marcus sees himself as a philosopher king. So in many ways, it's going to function like Augustine's Confessions, which is the first autobiography in history, I suppose, Western civilization. It functions as the first known autobiography. And the concern, first and foremost, is with the care of the soul. So virtue matters. The God within matters. And the God within here is this idea of what we're going to deal with called monism. And the Stoics can accurately be called monists. And Marcus follows the tradition of Epictetus in the discourses quite a bit. The reason I chose meditations is because the meditations, well, number one, I happened to just pick this book up in the last few weeks, and I had not read Marcus's Disputation. I think maybe in undergrad we had to read, like a selection of it or something. But I went ahead and read the meditations, and I thought it is a good companion. And they're going to see a lot of similarities to Christian theology early on, biblical theology. We're going to see similarities to, it's syncretic, which is interesting. So it does blend Platonism. It maybe even blends aspects of biblical or Christian thought, as well as the Roman ideas, Roman tradition and thought, which is very practical, very interested in legalities and bureaucracy and how to form a coherent functioning state. And what we're going to see is that Stoicism functions very well for the Roman mythos, for the Pax Romana. It's a lot of aphorisms, and it wasn't apparently intended to be something published. It was intended to be his personal diary, and I guess over time it was eventually published. So a lot of Platonic themes. One of those that's going to be preeminent is the control of the passions. The Stoics were at times even almost ascetics, right? They were very much into sobriety, temperance, and we're going to see that throughout these aphorisms. Another obvious key point that probably everybody's aware of who's heard of philosophy in any degree is that Stoicism is concerned with facing life's ills in terms of what you can and can't control. If you can't control something, no point worrying about it. It's out of your control. It's not something that you even need to worry about. Worry is pointless. We can think of similarities. Say the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, "Who of you, by worrying, can one add 1 inch to your stature?" Right? I mean, there's not really any point in worry, especially when it comes to things outside of your control, and that's a key dictum of Stoicism. So it's aphoristic in the way that perhaps Nietzsche or Wittgenstein are aphoristic in many of their writings. He does see philosophy as the totality answer to man's life and ills. So philosophy is the path by which you can find solace, find peace, and find answers. Philosophy promotes the life of virtue, as we've seen before. Again, this is straight out of Socrates. In Epictetus, many of the early Stoics had a high view of Socrates. They thought he was great. Not so much a lot of the metaphysics and ontology of Plato, but rather that within the dialogues you would see Socrates really laying out what it means to live a philosophical life. So it's a lot more interested in the aesthetic, in what's natural out there in the world, harmony with nature, and a lot less interested in these sort of big scale speculations about metaphysics and justifying your belief systems and so forth and so on. So they don't really care about that. Of course, the first Stoic that we'll talk about is Zeno, but we also have to talk about Epictetus. And a lot of it's going to deal with death. And so some people have called it an ontology of freedom in the face of death, which is interesting. You do tend to have this obsession or this acceptance of death in the Stoic tradition, facing death as something natural. And that's what we're going to look at, especially given the fact that we don't believe death is natural. Death is, in fact, very unnatural. But for Stoicism, it ends up being pantheistic, as we'll see. So that is, those are the foci, the focuses of Stoicism. And the introduction to my copy talks about it being proto-Christian. I don't know about all that. Epictetus, perhaps. But there were apparently times when Marcus thought he had mystical visions. And these mystical visions seem to be connected to the notion of an all-pervading providence over the universe, which is a Christian doctrine. And in fact, some of the other Stoics did, the argument is often made that they were influenced by Christian theology because they believed in providence, right? And you don't really have a sense of providence unless you believe in some kind of single God or source ruling the universe. Sometimes polytheism might talk about providence, but it's hard to see how there could really be providence if you have just a bunch of warring gods, right? Providence seems to presume or presuppose a single divine mind or single divine consciousness. So a lot of interesting stuff here. Did he have mystical visions that tied into his philosophies of Stoicism and the state and all that? maybe. But that's what we're going to look at today. So if you want to see the full thing, come over to Jay's Analysis, and we're going to do an in-depth look at the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, and we're going to talk about Marcus viewing himself as the philosopher king, straight out of Plato's Republic. And then we're also, of course, going to critique the philosophy and look at weaknesses in this position and whether or not it can accurately give us the kind of worldview that I think we want, that we all look for as human beings. So if we want to talk about the Roman period, and this would be roughly the period between, say, Aristotle and the first few Caesars, Christ's period, into the second century, first and second century. And that's, well, actually what we're going to do is we're going to look at roughly the 5 schools during this period. And you really only have a few options, and that's what's interesting about this. Not many offers from worldviews that are out there in terms of what we might call the secular perspective. And philosophy is a secular perspective. Now, you might could argue that Plato's philosophy has elements of the mystery schools or esotericism or something like that, Pythagoreanism. But ultimately, it's still the vision of reason, right? Reason conceived of as an abstract impersonal principle governing the universe. And we're going to see that logos principle actually at work in the philosophy of Marcus Aurelius. So you're gonna see like 5 basic schools, and what's neat is that the modern day philosophies of secularism, they don't present anything different than that. We still only have essentially these same 5 options in our day, and I think that's very telling. And with skepticism, first of all, we have obviously the idea of no absolutes, everything is relative. This would be like Pyrrho, right? The skeptics. And their perspective is based in this idea of, a lot of times, empiricism. We only know what's present to our 5 senses. That can be deceived quite often, and so therefore it doesn't make sense to think that there's any actual objective principles or truths. How could anybody claim to have access to these kinds of lofty ideas, when in fact true humility, right, opposition to human hubris, demands that's absolutely impossible. And so, but it's kind of a buffet style approach as well to philosophy. With skepticism, you might take a little bit of this, a little bit of that, but none of them are, quote, true. Now, as I pointed out in the little brief video that I did yesterday about relativism, skepticism is relativism. And so this is actually the dominant kind of philosophy of our day. And the problem with it is that it starts out contradicting itself on its own premises, as we pointed out in that brief video. It says there's no absolutes, everything is relative, but the problem is that claim itself has to also fall under the dictum of everything being relative, and so it's self-refuting on its own grounds, right? You can't say that there's no truth, right? Because that claim itself would then also have to be true. And the problem with this is that it's not a paradox, it's actually a contradiction. And there's a difference between a paradox and a contradiction. Even in formal logic or history of logic, logicians have discussed this topic. Even Bertrand Russell, right, the worst man ever, arguably the wickedest dude of all time, maybe. Even Russell noted the distinction between a paradox and a contradiction. So next we have the school of Epicureanism. And this is a kind of a materialistic, atomism. The world is just atoms falling through space. That's all there is. And it's hedonistic, but it's not hedonism in the sense of total moral abandon and total licentiousness. The hedonists actually thought that the best way to live was to live in a kind of moderated pleasure. So it's not just bodily sensate pleasures that are the best pleasures. It's a little bit of wine, a little bit of cheese, a little bit of Netflix, right? This is the highest levels of pleasure. Not Dionysian, Jim Morrison, pulling out his schlong on stage and having sex with microphones, right, while you're blitzed on a zillion drugs. That's not what they mean by hedonism. Of course, we don't really have any reason to accept that the intellectual pleasures necessarily are higher than the bodily pleasures on this perspective. I mean, in other words, Epicurus might prefer the intellectual conversational pleasures with his philosophical friends, but on what basis are we supposed to believe that that's actually objectively a better pleasure than, the whorehouse or something, right? I mean, maybe the Eyes Wide Shut party is a better pleasure than the philosophical nerd chat, right, in the Philosophy 101 class. Do you want to go to the party with Bill Harford, or do you want to, if we're just going to live for pleasure, right, or do you want to sit in Philosophy 101 with the fat guy with stinky armpits and debate the Matrix, right? So in other words, we don't really get any clear explication or reason to believe that the moderated hedonism of Epicurus is somehow a higher, more lofty pleasure. It's just assumed to be so than the pleasures of moral abandon. Now, the other school, the third option that we have in this rough period between, say, the prophet Malachi and the 2nd century, is Platonism. And now there's other options too in terms of like the Sibylline cult and the Mithra cult. There's other religious options, but right now we're just looking at like philosophy, secular philosophy during this period. Platonism, of course, the academy at Athens. We know what Plato and Platonism taught. The three characteristics of Platonism. If you've heard my lectures, you already know this stuff. We don't have to rehash this, but for those that haven't heard the Plato talks I've done in the last couple of years, including the totality of the Republic, in the Platonic scheme, you have basically dualism of the body and the soul, or of the realm of the forms and our world. The realm of the forms being invariant, unchanging, immaterial, and our world being material, flux, subject to constant becoming. And then you have rationalism, that the mind or the soul, the nous, the reason in man, is the highest faculty that's intended to govern the passions of the body, and it somehow taps into the realm of the forms directly, and so it is definitely a rationalist position. Platonism is. And then you have what we might call is just idealism, that the highest levels of reality, the absolute, etc., are in fact formal and ideal in an abstract mathematical type of sense, not in the realm of the here and the now. So that is the three basic principles that we'll find in Platonism. I got my fashy haircut today, and I got hair in my eye. So then Aristotelianism, and I got this haircut as a joke, by the way, because people were making fun of the last time I got this haircut. So anytime I get people making fun of things, I always charge forward into the thing that they're making fun of and saying, because I don't care. And so Aristotelianism, we haven't really dived into Aristotle yet. We will, I assure you, maybe in the next year or two. We're going to get pretty deep into Aristotle, cover some of the major works. The logic, the metaphysics, the poetics, the ethics. These are all important to understand in the history of philosophy. And I had plenty of graduate level Aristotle classes. I've spent a lot of time in Aristotle. Spent a lot of time in Aquinas, especially in my 20s. I mean, very, very intense, in-depth time in Aquinas' thought. I've got the whole Summa sitting right over here. I read a good portion of the Summa, as well as the Summa Contra Gentiles. I've read the entire volumes of that one, which is more of an apologetic work. And to do that, you have to be very familiar with Aristotle. There's no question about it. So we'll do that. We'll also do some Augustine. I've got some Augustine right here on this stack, right here I'm thumbing Augustine. We'll do some of that too. I thought City of God, monumental work in the history of philosophy. It should be analyzed. Nobody does full talks on the City of God. I will, and you need not doubt me because we did a full talk on tragedy and hope. So I read City of God when I was 21, and took all those questions to my Baptist professors, and they didn't have any answers, and they still don't. So you're going to get that here from me. You're not going to get that anywhere else. There's another professor who's going to take you through the entirety of the City of God, but I will. So then Aristotelianism is... Aristotle's school was located in the Lyceum as opposed to the Academy, and the Lyceum philosophers were called the Peripatetics, and they were called this because they would wander around, they would walk around, and sort of stroll about and philosophize. I do this. I don't know. Maybe I'm a descendant of Aristotle or something. I don't know, but generally speaking, if I'm doing an interview, if I'm talking or something, I like to be strolling about. I don't like being confined and having to sit here, but I'll do it. It's focused on obviously the teleology, right, which is purpose in the Greek, that things have a purpose to which they're moving towards and trying to attain. And so everything is in a movement from potentiality to actuality, right? So the acorn becomes the oak tree or whatever. So the acorn has the potential to become the full oak tree, the telos. The purpose of that seed is to transition into that final form. This is what characterizes Aristotle's philosophy. We could say that Aristotle's philosophy obviously is a more empirical approach, whereas with Platonism, it's kind of unless you make the argument that Platonism is ultimately a mystery school, initiatory kind of religious philosophy, which you could make that argument. It kind of is. But if you consider it just in its secular sense, then it's more focused, just simply speaking, in terms of epistemology, on reason, on thought and a priori mathematics, or these are characteristics that are not, generally speaking, empirical. So algorithms, these kinds of things, large geometric problems in mathematics, they might have a relationship to the physical world, but the objects of these disciplines themselves are not empirical, right? A kilogon is not an empirical thing out there in the world, but it is a real geometric thing. And so there's many other examples of this, right? A tesseract is not something actually out there in the world, but it's a real mathematical object. And so in that sense, because Plato believed that, and Pythagoras, they believed that these kinds of mathematical truths were the real higher truths, reality, ultimately speaking, is more in line with that kind of stuff than it is the flux and change of matter and decay and death in this world. And so in that regard, Aristotle's much more interested in studying the natural world. He's much more interested in biology than he is metaphysics, right? So, I mean, he doesn't have a problem writing a book about metaphysics, but his metaphysics is different, right? So he'll take form. He believes in objective form. He's a realist, so to speak, but those forms are all instantiated for him in time and space in some configuration of matter. Right, so matter is impressed with some form, always. There's not an abstract realm out there, a transcendent realm, where the true formal principles reside, and there is for Plato. So next we come to Stoicism, Cynicism, and there's a similarity between those two schools. We are going to be talking about Stoicism today, as I said, with Marcus Aurelius, but we have in Stoicism this emphasis on harmony between nature, reason, and virtue. All of these three are kind of mystically linked almost, to where if you're living right, you're living in accord with reason, and reason lives in accord with the principles that are manifested out there in nature, in the natural world. So virtue is to be natural, virtue is to be rational, and to be rational and natural is to live according to reason. And so all of these three are linked. Now, how do they get that? Well, they're all linked because there is, as we said, some sort of in the mind of the Stoics, a universal principle. It's a universal principle that governs all reality. It's a kind of force of reason, or logos. And they will actually use the term logos. Now, they don't mean it in the sense of what John 1:1 is talking about in the Gospel of John, that in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God, and all things are made through him, for him, by him, etc., etc. That's not what they're talking about, because they don't believe in creation. For the Stoics, for the Roman philosophers, they inherit the Greek idea of cycles, that reality is not created. It's just a kind of an eternal manifestation of itself, extending out forever and ever and ever and ever. And in fact, this is kind of an eternal recurrence type of view. Metempsychosis, you're just going to live the life that you've lived now over and over and over again. It's just going to repeat. And they believe that because they would look out in the world, and Marcus is going to say this in his meditations, that he says that the universal principle, Mother Earth / Mother Universe, something kind of what Plato talks about in the Timaeus, gives birth to all of these various living forms and living creatures. And then they have a time period where they exist, and then they die, and they return to the natural world. And so, presumably, they're just recycled, right? And this is where we would get the idea of transmigration of souls, metempsychosis. Presumably, when you break down and return to dust, the rational soul principle that inhabits you, your body or whatever, is also presumably going to meld back into the all, and then be at some point germinated, sperminated. The universe will shoot its wad, and you will come back into existence at some point. And this is why, of course, all the traditional, what we call pagan religions, believed in the generative principle, right? So that the universe is governed by this principle of birth, cycle of birth, living your life, death, and then process repeats. Rinse and repeat for all eternity. So what's going to mark these views is no doctrine of creation. Now, there might be some kind of mythology of the gods falling and titans and this kind of stuff in an ancient golden age, but that's not what actually sets the biblical theology, for example, apart from these views, is that time is not viewed as a prison. Time is not viewed, and to be fair to the Stoics, they don't really view time as a prison or something necessarily bad, but they view it as as governed by fate. But you'll find these inconsistencies in these views where it's everything's governed by fate, but you also have the ability to live and act virtuously, which presumes free will. So, it's very, it's not actually harmonized with a lot of the things that it believes. It's very contradictory in many points. And we're actually going to see that in the meditations. I'm going to point out to you the times where Marcus consistently contradicts himself. That's not to say that it's all bad. I mean, there's some good points here and there. He makes some good arguments. He has some good insights that in many ways echo Ecclesiastes, right? He sounds a lot like Solomon at times, and in a sense you could argue Solomon was a kind of philosopher king. A lot of it will echo the Proverbs, right? Or Sirach, Ecclesiasticus in the Deuterocanon. So I wanted to in my notes go back to this point of understanding that these 5 rough outlines of the positions in this time period are really repeats of the worldviews that we have today. If you go to the university and you study philosophy, or if you are involved in civic discourse or whatever is supposed to be out there in the world as your options, you're really only going to get a handful, this handful is regurgitated and given to you again. There's not a whole lot of other options out there unless you turn to something, if a different religious perspective or something, which would probably be classed by most people under mysticism, right? So the idea, of course, is that religion is not in the realm of reason and logic and all this kind of stuff. There's reason and logic over here, philosophy and worldviews and politics and this and that. And then there's a religion over here, which is based on faith and mysticism, and it doesn't really have any basis. There's no real coherent reason why people believe it. It's just what they happen to be believing and growing up in. The perspective, obviously, that we're going to take, that I'm going to argue for and demonstrate, I think, hopefully, is that's just simply not true. That the ultimate foundations of these positions that we want to hold to, like we want to believe there is some kind of metaphysic, there is some kind of epistemology, there is some kind of ethic. The ultimate foundations of those three basic divisions of philosophy are ultimately religious in nature, and they can only be given a coherent basis in a certain kind of theology. At least that's the argument that I'm going to make. But so when we talk about nothing new under the sun is essentially what we're trying to say here, right? As Solomon says, hearkening back to Ecclesiastes. And so you only have a finite number of options and worldviews that you can pick here. I guess you could actually kind of make the same argument for religion and theology. You don't have a whole lot of options there. I mean, you can start with God or theology and say, okay, either I believe in a personal or an impersonal absolute principle. And if you choose either, I mean, because there are only two options there. There's not like a middle. If you choose the middle ground, then the objective principle that you're choosing is not personal still, right? And I mean, and even if you tried some far Eastern perspective, which says, oh, that's a duality and I don't want either one of those, well, it's still some unknown absolute that has absolutely no connection to you, right? So you're still not avoiding the question by saying that I don't want either one of those. And now if you choose neither of those and you say, well, I don't believe, well, then you're back in the school of skepticism, agnosticism, or something like this, which I believe is a dead end. So we don't have many roads to go down there. It's a dead end pretty quick. Again, so only a finite number of religious views, as well as only a finite number of these sort of secular views. As we're going to see, that's where we're going to argue here. Stoicism was very popular in the empire, and we're going to see why that is, because it's a perfect philosophy for the Roman Imperium. It took over the reputation of the Greeks for scholarship. They were very interested in being scholarly, and they liked this Hellenized worldview idea, as we said. And it was kind of a Roman philosophy for the entirety of the empire, was the governing principle here. We begin with Zeno around 320 BC, and the school was called this. They would do their teaching in this area called the Stoa, which is the porch. And they had, as we said, a very high view of Socrates. Another kind of rival school around this period was the Cynics, and the Cynics were also students of Socrates, but they, again, didn't care for the metaphysics. They were only concerned with the process of the dialogues and the argumentation. And the Cynics believed that it showed that bad things in life should just simply be accepted with a kind of cold, calm indifference. And this is also what the Stoics would hold to too. So they both share this view. The Cynics, though, tended to be a little more antisocial and were anarchic and revolutionary at times. They had a kind of anarcho-revolutionary perspective. And the Stoics didn't agree with that. They were more into high culture and order and hierarchy, right? So Zeno, one of the key early Cynics, or who studied there, said, you know what, this anarchy principle is stupid. There's nothing helpful to the whole of society out there by trying to be an anarcho-cynic. It doesn't do anybody any good, and it's really self-destructive. It's just you. If you want to be a revolutionary and try to fight everybody and make everybody conform to your ideas, you're wasting your time. You might as well go live out in the woods. Get over it. It's not going to happen. You're not going to change everybody's mind. So there's no point in being upset about the stuff that you can't change, right? There's the whole idea here was to be indifferent to the things that we can't change. And if that's the case, why are you trying to change everybody, man? It ain't going to happen. So to live a calm, virtuous life, you need not try to convince the entire society of you're wasting your time and energy and zeal trying to convince the society of the rightness of your cynicism. Now, Zeno keeps, however, some of the ideas of the Cynics. He likes this idea of passive, indifferent acceptance of what comes your way. So that was good, and he wanted to carry that over. And then, but what's interesting about the Stoics with Zeno is that Zeno he's not a Platonist. He likes the empirical ideas of Aristotle more than he likes as we said, the metaphysical ideas. And so because Aristotle was an empiricist, you could argue that Zeno is actually a little more consistent. Now, I actually do argue this often, criticizing and critiquing Aristotle, especially given the Roman Catholic and the Thomistic obsession with Aristotle. Zeno is actually a little more consistent, because if we're blank slates, and if our experience is just writing impressions upon the video camcorder of our mind or whatever, then it really doesn't make sense to believe that form is out there in the world, like Aristotle said. The objects that you think have form, that formalness that you're talking about, Aristotle, remember Aristotle, you rejected Plato and the idea of transcendent forms. That formalness is a construct in here. And your mind is imposing that on the objects out there in the world, right? I mean, there's nothing about that object out there in the world that makes you know for sure that it has formalness. It's your mind constructing this idea of a form and imposing it upon that object. So Zeno, in this way, is kind of a forerunner to the hardcore empiricists of the Enlightenment period, like a Locke or a Hume, right, or Berkeley. So Zeno is a little more consistent with this idea than Aristotle, I would say. Now, I don't agree with Stoicism and Zeno, but I'm just making this point. Now, here's the Zeno weirdness here. What does Zeno say is the ultimate totality of reality? It's fire. What did Heraclitus say? Well, he's getting this from Heraclitus, right? So, only matter is real. Where all of reality is just atoms falling through space, and ultimate reality is just fire. So, again, something that he just took from Heraclitus, and this is where we see that buffet style approach from the Stoics. So Stoicism comes from Heraclitus. The details come from Aristotle. And it makes no grand contributions to ontology or metaphysics. In fact, it rejects that stuff. It's mainly focused on ethical philosophy, which is interesting. Again, and you can see why, because you're not ever going to get access to forms. There's no point in trying to do metaphysics. You might as well focus on the good life. And what's the good life? Living in harmony with reason, nature, and virtue. Knowledge is only good when it helps us fit into harmony with nature, would be the dictum here. Now, oddly enough, there is a logos principle that permeates the universe. This logos principle is described as providence, and that's what we're going to see in Marcus. There's a lot of weird ideas attached onto this, so law or maxims within the state are conceived to be in accord with this logos universal principle. So you can begin to see why it makes sense for a Roman emperor to adhere to Stoicism. You're probably going to encounter tragedy as a Roman emperor. Your buddy, your BFFs might stab you in the back and take over being Caesar. Something like this could happen, right? They might murder your family. You might lose a giant military campaign. Maybe thousands of your soldiers die. You're bound for tragedy in a pretty extreme sense, probably, if you're a Roman emperor. So, but not only that, it also could appeal to the emperor because it views the state as the incarnation of the universal principle of reason. And what is the incarnation of the state but the emperor, right? So the emperor is God because he is the incarnation of the universal reason principle, which is the universe as a whole. So the entire universe, the macrocosm, is contained in the microcosm of the state. The microcosm of the state, which is the entire Roman Imperium, is contained in Caesar, right? So it has an interesting globalist perspective. It says that all men are brothers under this universal principle of reason, and all men are brothers because they're all members of the Roman Imperium. Interesting. So from Stoicism comes this idea of the cosmopolis, right? Not the David Cronenberg movie, but the cosmopolis of a giant world city-state. Ethically speaking, everybody has to do their duty, right? And you do your duty for duty's sake. That's just what you do, because that's in accord with reason, and it's in accord with the state, and it's in accord with the universal logos principle, which is not, again, Jesus. That's not the logos that we're talking about. The logos we're talking about here is just a generic sort of just idea that, oh, I have reason. There does seem to be order out there in the world, and so the entire universe must in some sense have just a rational calculating faculty. But it's not conceived of as a single divine mind or God that you could have a relationship with. So it's very distinct from the kind of the I am that we see in Exodus 3:14 of the Bible, right? It's not Jehovah, God, having a covenant relationship with his people, manifested ultimately in the incarnation with Jesus or anything like that. It's just an abstract philosophical principle, kind of roughly maybe like what we saw with Plato and the Pythagoreans, how they viewed mathematics as being a kind of overriding universal ordering principle, but it's still abstract and it's still impersonal. It's not a single omniscient divine creator or anything like that. So for the citizen, you have all these obligations that make you a good, virtuous citizen, and that means that everything's in its place. You live according to your station in life. You don't need anarchy and revolutions or anything like that, because that's against good order, and you might as well just, accept your lot in life. And if you do that with a healthy, passive resignation and live your life with sobriety and frugality, then that's the best way to live. You're going to be happiest that way. If it was supposed to be otherwise, then the gods would have created you otherwise, right? If you were meant to rise up in the ranks and become emperor yourself, or if you were meant to go from being a plebeian to a patrician, or if you were meant to go from being the poor guy to King Midas or something like this, then the gods would have made you that way. Don't worry about spending your life exerting all this energy and trying to increase your station in life, because that's ultimately futile, and it's ultimately out of accord with the principle of universal reason. So service to the state ultimately is the highest good here. And again, the state is embodied in the figure of the Roman Imperium, embodied in the figure of Marcus Aurelius. So again, attaining peace of mind, as we said, is just simply to live in accord with these principles. Cicero, Epictetus, these are famous Stoics, and again, Cicero was very eclectic in his perspective. Epictetus is around 50 AD, and what's interesting about Epictetus is that he seems to be the most sort of kind of Christian. He appears to have actually been influenced by Christian theology, and this is why providence plays such a central role in his Stoicism. But it's still not really Christian. I mean, you get these sort of generic ideas of bear and forbear. This is the famous teaching of Epictetus, and so you bear with what the universe sends you, and you forbear with your fellow men, and that's just the best way to be happy. And so when we come to 120 to 180 AD, this is the Marcus Aurelius period. And what we're going to see is we live in a cosmos that is in perpetual flux and change. Change is the most certain, is the certitude of this life. Which doesn't make any sense, by the way, because if the only certitude is change, we can do a presuppositional critique of that and point out that, well, is everything is change also subject to change? Right, so I mean, the principle itself would over time not be true, which doesn't make any sense. We make the same argument, which I often do against Darwinian and evolutionary thought, because they try to include everything under the principle of evolutionary flux and movement. Well, does that mean that the principle of evolutionary flux and movement is also eventually going to evolve to not be true? I mean, it's just nonsense, right? So looking at my Marcus Aurelius notes here. Yeah, the universe is a living, intelligent, giant being. It's like, if you think about Gaia as Mother Earth, well, this is like Gaia as Mother Universe. The entire cosmos is a giant living organism, and we're kind of like little cells on the body of the giant universal organism, which is kind of, again, from Plato and the Timaeus, where the universe is a giant living being. Now, you can see why the Roman Imperium likes this idea, because, again, we go back to Plato and Platonism, and even the ancient Egyptians taught this idea of the microcosm and the macrocosm, that everything that's in the macrocosm is in a way contained in the microcosm. Now, we believe that doctrine as it pertains to the incarnation. This is the teaching of St. Maximus the Confessor when he talks about the incarnation. But that's a different topic. We'll get to that down the road. Now, the Stoics are all pantheists, and so this universe being, this giant living entity, kind of gives birth to itself from itself. So you are a manifestation, a seminal spermal manifestation that kind of is birthed out of Mother Universe for your time period, the allotment of your life, as we said. And then you die, and you kind of go back into Mother Universe reabsorbs you into her bosom. And so again, that pantheism we're going to see is very prominent in Meditations. Change is the fabric of the universe, and yet at the same time you have man has a spark of natural divinity within him, and that's his reason. So man is, Marcus says, a morsel of the divine. You're like a little ligament, this little muscle here of the giant universe being that's you, right? Or a little nipple being on Mother Universe. That's you. Man is also a social civic being, right? So he's not an island, he's not a hermit. Normally speaking, he doesn't go live on his own. He's not anarchic. He needs other human beings. He needs a social order. And that's what the Roman Imperium is there to provide. True duty is to be a good Roman citizen. That's your whole duty. That's your whole existence, is to be a healthy, functioning, staying in your place Roman citizen. And interestingly, the unfortunate aspect of this, which I think we're going to see, is that embrace with death. and the pro-death attitude, in the sense of you should accept your death because death is natural. It's just part of the natural world. In this view, is that suicide is a logical component of this view. And actually Marcus will say, actually there is a noble aspect to suicide. And we can see from all of the pagan worldviews that don't believe in things like resurrection, or they don't believe in creation and resurrection, which actually go together as revealed doctrines. They're stuck in fate. They're stuck in the never-ending flat circle of time and cycles and reincarnation and metempsychosis. Death is part of this natural process, right? And you're going to die. Death is therefore natural. So you might as well just love and accept death as much as you love and accept life. They're almost dualistic, two sides of the same coin, aren't they? Because as these pagans argue, death gives life meaning and life gives death meaning, right? No, we do not believe that. And in fact, we're going to look at Acts 17, where Paul goes and deals with the Greeks and the philosophers who have these kinds of views, and will argue and debate and do apologetics with them. So I'm going to be giving you the kind of Acts 17 approach in answer to the Stoicism of Marcus Aurelius. So that concludes the sort of overview, and next we're going to move to the actual text itself and look at some of Marcus's aphorisms and teachings and doctrines. You've been listening to Jay's Analysis. You've been listening to Jay's Analysis. We've been talking about Marcus Aurelius. This is the first half for free. The second half, of course, you can obtain by subscribing to Jay's Analysis for $4.95 a month or for $60 a year at the PayPal links at my site. You can also get my book there at my website, Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film, which deals with philosophy in film, geopolitics, the esoteric, in relationship to movies from the greats like Kubrick, Hitchcock, Spielberg, Ridley Scott, all kinds of popular films. And the book's done really well. It's only been out a month and a half, 2 months. I've already had 40 5-star reviews across markets. So avail yourself and get a signed copy from me, Jay Dyer. You can see the book right here, Esoteric Hollywood. And you can get that at my site, as I said, jaysanalysis.com. Thank you for watching.